Hi, this is JD with Wildwood Digital Media. Today I'm going to show you how to take a comma-separated value data document and turn that into a path in After Effects. You will not need to do any manual work like creating points on the path. I'm going to show you how to allow the data to do that for you, just using some expressions and some JavaScript. Here we go. Step number one is make sure you have some data. This is some COVID data. I'm going to get you a link down below for where you can get the COVID data. I copied just a few pieces of the whole CSV into a new sheet, and I have Excel, so I'm using Excel. You could do it in a different spreadsheet program if you want. And I just pasted that in. I kept the header row, and I have the ISO code, which is the country code, location, date, and total cases. So I kept the first four columns, kept the header row, and then I pasted the rest of the data in there. This is the total cases of COVID in France. So I'm going to go ahead and I save that as a CSV file. I'm going to go back into After Effects now, and we're going to go ahead and create a new, actually because I already have a project open, let me go ahead and do a new composition for you. I'm going to keep that as 1920 by 1080, and we'll call this new one as blank line COVID. That title doesn't make a lot of sense, but it doesn't matter. This is just to show you how to do it. So 1920 by 1080, it doesn't really matter for your purposes as well what aspect ratio you choose. Just know that a lot of the functions and the JavaScript and the expressions, all this programming we're going to be doing, it's dynamic. So if you do a square composition, it should respond in many instances if you have the programming done correctly for that. Okay, we're here now. First thing we're going to do is grab the pen tool, G on your keyboard if you want, or just click it. Go ahead, pick 2 points, make a line. I have mine set to a width of 10 or a stroke of 10. And I click off of that, and as you can see, I have made a line. Down below, you can see we have a shape layer here. I have already imported my FranceCovidCases.csv. I'm going to go ahead and drag that in there as well. And then the only other thing I need before I start programming is under Effects over here, we're going to go ahead and type Slider. We are going to grab a slider control and drag it onto the shape layer. And we're going to rename that. I believe the name I have used is maximum Y value. I can always go back and change that if I need to. And for our purposes, for the height of this, because we're going to use the entire composition here as our graph, and if I wanted to make it look really nice and add some labels, I can drop this composition into another composition and beautify it. But for our purposes, we just want this to show the data, and we'll have the top here be our highest point. And I know there's around 160,000 cases, unfortunately, in France. So we're going to put that as our maximum Y value. And no matter what the data is, you can sort of make all of this work dynamically, and you'll have a slider to change it based upon what you're putting into that. Okay, so here you have it set up. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sort of ignore my composition here, my visuals, and I'm going to hit tilde and maximize all of this so we can begin to do the expressions, which are going to be the meat, and it's going to really solve almost all your problems. Go ahead and expand everything as I have done. And the first thing you're going to need to do is go under Path and expand that. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paste some code in here, and you're going to be able to see what it does and how I did it. Rather than me typing everything out for you again, I'll just go through it line by line, and you'll have a much better understanding of what each variable does, what each function does, etc. So now we have an easy way to visualize all of this, and you're able to see the expression, which looks quite intensive. It is a little bit cumbersome if you don't know programming, but I'm going to try and explain it as best as I can, such that you can replicate it yourself and it will work. First off, you should know that After Effects is not a stickler about having variable in front of your variables. Unlike normal programming, you don't need to have VAR. I do it just because I want to stick to proper JavaScript syntax. And sometimes After Effects will also let you get by without semicolons. We're going to be using semicolons here in all instances to try and match up with JavaScript. I'm not a great programmer, but I do know enough to know that let's try and stick to good syntax. That way you don't make a mistake if you try this in another program that uses JavaScript and you find some way to use your JavaScript knowledge that you've taken here and use it in another place. Just know that that's why I'm doing this, that you'll know the proper. Okay, first off, we have variable number of points. And the way I want you to think of this is the number of rows in your data set is going to determine the number of points on your line. Because each point, you can think of it as going up and down, and you're going to need that number of points in order to have a way to visualize your graph. And the easiest way to do that is go down here to your CSV and you have a number of rows, and it says that right here for you. And all I did to get this big long thing you see here, I'll delete it. I grab the pick whip and I drag it to number of rows, and it's there. Next, spacing for points. Spacing for points, so we have the number of points on the line that we're going to need, with each one being represented by a different data point. Each day is a data point in my data set, and each day has a particular number of total cases. And with that, we need to know how to space out these points on our line, right? So where should we put them? Well, the easiest thing to do is take the width of your composition, which you have a built-in function for, which is called thisComp.width, which is, in my case, 1080, but if you did a square composition, it was 1000, it'll do it all for you automatically. And then if your number of rows changes, if you load different data in, and it doesn't have 127 rows, it'll also do the math for you. So we do thisComp.width divided by number of points, and it's going to do the math for me. And I now know how many pixels, because this number is the number of pixels between each point. Right? I have this long line that in my case is stretching 1080 pixels, and every X number of pixels is a point on the line. I'm going to start the line, my first point at 0. So starting space X, I called that 0. We could have called it starting point X. For some reason I chose space X. Maybe it was because of the launch today into space, but whatever the case is, you could call point X. That might make more sense. Starting at 0, because the first point on our line will be 0. And then the path. The path is something you'll see a lot in After Effects. So I don't have to type this big long thing here all the time. I go ahead and I just call it the path, and then I'll delete it. And what I can do is I can pick whip right above the path. That's what that does. It just allows me to write the path each time instead of typing out or having long code that says this. Content shape 1.content. We can get rid of all that and just write the path from here on out. The maximum value, we're going to tie that to our slider that we created earlier. I did get the naming right. I called it maximum Y value. We'll go ahead and just show you how to do that. I am here, grab my pick whip again, and I will go like that. And I now have that. My maximum Y value is set to whatever my slider is set at. Maybe in a later video, I'm going to do a sort function and have the JavaScript grab the highest value. But for right now, we just have a slider, and I'm going to set it a little bit above whatever I know my highest value. So if I'm in the 150,000, so I'm going to just pick 160,000, and I set it there. And then finally, line height, I'm going to be setting at 0. You'll get into that here in a second. Basically, I'm just initializing that variable that I'm going to be using later. Initialize is a fancy way of saying I'm going to be using the variable inside my for loop, but I want to go ahead and create it outside of my for loop before I get into it. Because one thing, if you don't know much about programming, is if you initialize a variable to 0 inside of a for loop, every time that runs, it's going to reset to 0, because looping is designed to run something more than once. Therefore, you don't want to have that inside of your loop. I'm also going to initialize an array of points. And if you're not familiar with arrays, arrays are variables where we're grouping multiple things in one box. Think of an array like a box, and each thing in the box is separated by a comma. For example, if I type the number 9 here, and I type the number 10, now I have 2 things in the box. And for example, that could be a useful position. This would be a good positional array where we have an x and a y coordinate, which many things in expressions are going to be an array with 2 things, an x and a y, or a height and a width percentage value. So in our case, we're actually going to have an array of arrays. And what that means for you is you can take this grouping, 9 and 10, and then you can put another grouping in the box. By box, I mean an array. And so here I have an array of arrays. There's my array number 1 in there. There's my array number 2 in there. And one very important thing to note, if you're not very well versed in programming, is that the first item in your array is item 0. So this is item 0. This is item 1, or index 0 and index 1. And then in that array, I can delve even deeper. This item in this array is item 0. This array is item number 1, 0, and 1. So this would be array index number 1, and then the index of that, the value 3, would be 0. So 1 in a bracket, and then 0 in a bracket. And that'll make more sense here in a second. But let's go ahead and delete that because I'm initializing it as empty. Basically, I'm creating this array that I'm going to go ahead and fill up in a minute empty. Now I'm going to do a for loop. If you're not familiar with looping, looping is just a way to do something multiple times. And I'm going to need to populate every single point on this line until I have done all the rows. So here's what we're going to do. We're doing a for loop. We're going to have a variable of I, set it to 0, which is useful because our indexes of our arrays are also 0. And we want it to be less than the number of points. And you remember the number of points is also the same as the number of rows in our data. So basically, we're going to go through each row of the data, pull the number out, put it into a point on a path, and then move on to the next point. Okay? And I++, this is common syntax. Again, I'll paste all of this in the YouTube video. You can go ahead and copy and paste it just so you understand what is going on. And in here, first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull the data. I do data is equal to thisComp.layer dot COVIDCases dot. All I need to do to replicate that is go up here, grab the pick whip, boom. Daily deaths. I need to know each day how many people are dying. And this is a more complicated one because you might be asking yourself, well, how did he get daily footage, data value? Well, this is actually very useful that you can open up the data down here by clicking on these triangles, and you can see things like this. And then if you'll notice, on row 33, it says in red here, 17 people, or so 17 cases there are. And I copied this because I know this is row 33 on the fourth item, because 0 is the first item, in the fourth column in the data, row 33, column 4 is going to be the number 17. And so once I figured out how it had organized it here, I went ahead and I copied that and I pasted it right here. And then I knew that the only thing I need to change, because the column is always going to have column 3, which begin, and remember, because 0 is the first column, 1, then 2, then 3. So this is the last column. It's actually the 4th column, but for our purposes in computer science language, it's the 3rd column because we're also using 0. The second number is going to be my row. And we want to iterate or go down through the rows one by one by one, starting with row 0. And here we go. Oh, by the way, I call this daily des. Unfortunately, it's daily cases. We're mapping something a little bit less gruesome. Okay, for line height, what we're going to do is we're going to use JavaScript's linear function to remap the daily cases, which we know is a number that's somewhere between 0 cases and 150-some thousand, I believe is the number. And for our purposes, I actually know that there's the minimum's 3, but I'm going to go ahead and put 0 in as the minimum number, and I'm going to drag the slider as close to the maximum number as I can. If we're being technical, and we're talking at numbers of potentially half a pixel, a quarter of a pixel, so the numbers don't really matter that much because it's getting rounded off in the visualization anyhow. But if you wanted to be most precise, you would sort the data and find the actual minimum number and the actual maximum number as your first 2 values here in your linear function. But for our purposes, 0 and 160,000 should be fine. And again, you're providing the data through daily cases. Now, your 3rd and 4th items in the linear function are how you want to remap it, right? So the scale of the data is between 3 and 150,000, but we need to remap that so it fits on a composition between 0 pixels and 1,080 pixels. So I'm going to provide that. The first number is actually the stroke width divided by 2, because you need to start the line a few pixels above where you think you should, because otherwise your line will actually be below the canvas. So that's kind of a quirky one that you don't have to do. You could just set it at 0. I prefer to see the entirety of the line, so the bottom half of the line, because your path is really 1 pixel, but if you have a 10 pixel stroke on your path, you're going to cut off 5 of those pixels. That's why I did it to be my minimum number is the stroke width of the shape, which again I pick whipped from right here, stroke width. So I pick whipped the stroke width to here, and then I divided it out by 2. That way I would be able to see my whole line. But you can put 0 in this number and it will work fine. You will just lose some of the line below the composition, the visible composition surface, which I didn't prefer. And then the last number is the composition height. It'll do this dynamically for you. And then finally, you have to times the whole thing by -1 because 0 is actually in the top left corner. It's inverted from how you would learn in conventional geometry. Next, you have to go to your array of points, item number I, index I, and which doesn't actually exist right now. So we're going to create an array of points, index, whatever your for loop is on, is equal to, and you're going to add your starting space x, which you have already declared, and we declared it here at 0. So our first space on the line is 0. And then you do your line height, which is automatically created for you through this algorithm. You need to increment your starting space x and go to the next value. Well, we know the spacing is up here, so we do starting space x plus equal to spacing for points, and we will move the path along the line. Last but not least, you have to use this variable called the path.createPath, and this is really awesome. What this does is this built-in function. If you remember, we created the path. The path is just the name of this shape layer. .createPath is a built-in function, and you write points. The points up in your line are equal to the array of points right here. Don't touch this. Don't touch that. Is closed equal to false. If you don't do is closed is equal to false, what you're going to end up with is a triangle, because it'll try and close it off with a line. And that's it. This is kind of a magic formula from After Effects for us, a magic function that's going to take all those points we just added to this array, and it's an array of arrays if we were actually to visualize it, and it's going to turn that into points. Okay, go ahead and hit tilde. You're going to notice it's not centered. I'm going to go ahead and hit shape layer, align, boom, done. There is your graph. Let's make that 100%. There you go. Making it beautiful is up to you. If you found this tutorial useful and helpful, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Thanks.